The year was 1230. Within the damp, suffocating stone walls of the Benedictine monastery in Podlis, Bohemia, a man stood on the precipice of a slow, agonizing death. His name was Herman, later to be known as Hermanus Monachus, or Herman the Recluse. He had committed a sin so grave, an infraction of the monastic code so severe, that the abbots had decreed a punishment from which there was no return. He was to be walled up alive. The masons were already mixing the mortar, the heavy stones stood ready to seal his tomb, and the air in his small cell felt like it was already running out. Desperation is a powerful alchemist. In a final, frantic bid for his life, Herman made an impossible vow. He promised the monastery that if they spared him, he would create a book in a single night that would glorify the monastery forever, a book that would contain all human knowledge, a testament to the greatness of their order and the wisdom of God. The abbots, perhaps out of a cruel sense of irony or a flicker of greed for such a relic, agreed. "One night," they said. "By dawn the book must be complete, or the wall will be finished." As the sun dipped below the Bohemian horizon, Herman sat before a vast stack of prepared vellum. But as the hours ticked by, the crushing reality of his task shattered his spirit. He had barely finished a few lines of the Vulgate. His hand trembled, his ink ran dry, and the silence of the monastery felt like a mocking shroud. Realizing that God had not answered his prayers for a miracle, Herman did the unthinkable. He turned his prayers downward. He called upon the fallen angel, the Prince of Darkness, and offered his soul in exchange for the completion of the manuscript. The legend says the devil answered. With a flash of unholy light and the stench of sulfur, the great adversary himself took the quill. By the time the first rays of the morning sun touched the monastery's stained glass, the book was finished. It was a behemoth, the largest manuscript the world had ever seen. And there on page 290 was the proof of the pact, a terrifying, full-page portrait of the devil, squatting in a void, staring back at the world with green eyes and two flickering tongues. This is the legend, but the reality of the Codex Gigas, the giant book, is even more fascinating and arguably more miraculous than the myth. Standing 36 inches tall, 20 inches wide, and nearly 9 inches thick, the Codex Gigas is a physical impossibility of the medieval age. It weighs a staggering 165 pounds, 75 kilograms, requiring 2 grown men just to lift it. To create its 310 parchment leaves, historians estimate that the skins of approximately 160 donkeys were used. This was not just a book, it was a library in a single binding. For the international audience of the 13th century, this was the ultimate encyclopedia. It didn't just contain the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. It held the Etymology by Isidore of Seville, a 20-volume compendium of all medieval knowledge, the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War by Flavius Josephus, a collection of medical treatises including the works of Hippocrates and Galen, and the Chronicle of Bohemia by Cosmas of Prague. It even contained practical guides, calendars, lists of monastery members, and most mysteriously, a series of spells and incantations for curing illnesses, catching thieves, and exorcising demons. As the centuries passed, the Devil's Bible became a cursed treasure, a prize for kings and a source of dread for monks. It stayed in Podlis until the monastery fell into financial ruin. The Cistercian monks of Sedlec bought it, but shortly after, a devastating plague struck their lands. Many whispered that the book had brought the shadow of its dark co-author with it. The book's journey eventually led it to the court of Rudolf II in Prague, the eccentric Holy Roman Emperor who was obsessed with the occult, alchemy, and the bizarre. Rudolf became mesmerized by the Codex, keeping it in his cabinet of curiosities. But the book's presence seemed to coincide with the decline of his sanity and power. In 1648, during the final throes of the 30 Years' War, the Swedish army laid siege to Prague. They looted Rudolf's treasures, and the Codex Gigas was hauled away as war booty to Stockholm, destined for the library of Queen Christina. In Sweden, the book faced its greatest trial. In 1697, a catastrophic fire broke out at the royal palace in Stockholm. As the flames licked the walls of the royal library, a desperate official realized the Codex Gigas could not be carried down the narrow staircases. In a move of sheer desperation, he threw the 165-pound manuscript out of a high window. The legend says the book landed on a passerby, injuring them, and the impact caused some of its pages to flutter away, lost forever to the wind. The charred edges of its cover still tell the story of that near destruction. Today, the Codex Gigas sits in a climate-controlled vault at the National Library of Sweden. But the mystery remains: who really wrote it? Modern forensic analysis has yielded a discovery that is perhaps more chilling than the legend of the devil. For years, paleographers, experts in ancient handwriting, believed the book was the work of a lifetime, perhaps 20 or 30 years of labor by multiple scribes. However, recent microscopic analysis of the ink and the pen strokes revealed something shocking. The entire book, every letter, every decoration, every one of the millions of characters, was written by a single person. The consistency of the handwriting is so perfect that it suggests the scribe's hand did not age, falter, or change over the decades it would have taken to write it. It is as if the book were indeed written in a single, continuous flow of energy. National Geographic researchers estimated that if a scribe worked 24 hours a day without stopping for food or sleep, it would take 5 years of continuous writing to complete the text alone. Excluding the intricate illustrations, in a realistic medieval setting, with only 5 or 6 hours of daylight and the need for rest, the Codex Gigas should have taken at least 30 years to finish. Yet the ink remains uniform from start to finish. This suggests a singular obsession, a man who perhaps did wall himself up not as a punishment, but as a choice, dedicating every waking second of his existence to this one monumental task until his last breath. When you look at the portrait of the devil on page 290, you aren't just looking at a piece of medieval art. You are looking at the centerpiece of a psychological mystery. Opposite the devil is a depiction of the heavenly city. The book presents a choice: the divine and the damned, the light of knowledge and the darkness of the soul. Whether it was a pact with a demon or the superhuman dedication of a lonely monk seeking redemption, the Codex Gigas remains a bridge between worlds. It is a reminder that in the silence of a cloister, under the flicker of a tallow candle, the human spirit, or something far more ancient, once attempted to capture the entire universe between two covers of wood and leather. And if you stand before it today in Stockholm, looking at the vibrant, green-faced demon, you might just feel a chill. You might wonder if Herman is still there, bound to his creation, waiting for the next reader to turn the page and invite the shadows back into the light. To continue this epic journey into the heart of the Devil's Bible, we must move beyond the legend of the single night and explore the hidden chapters of its existence, the bizarre contents that modern science is still trying to decode, and the trail of misfortune that followed its owners through history. Part II, the anatomy of an unholy encyclopedia, while the portrait of the devil is what made the Codex Gigas famous. The content surrounding it is what makes it truly unsettling. Imagine a monk in the 13th century working in near-total silence. As he moves past the holy scriptures of the Bible, his quill begins to scratch out something far darker. 1. The Exorcism, manuals nestled among the pages of the New Testament, and the works of Josephus are several pages dedicated to magic and incantations. These weren't the white magic of the church, but specific ritualistic spells. The spells for thieves. There are detailed instructions on how to identify a thief using mystical rituals involving bread and water. Curing the falling sickness. The Codex contains specific formulas to drive out the demons of epilepsy and fever. The shadow of the demon. Curiously, these spells are located just a few pages after the famous devil portrait. To a medieval mind, having the image of the devil and the spells to control him in the same book was like having a cage and the beast that lives inside it. 2. The Heavenly City versus. The Prince of Darkness on page 289, directly opposite the devil, is an illustration of the Heavenly City. It is a stark contrast. The city represents hope, order, and the divine structure of the afterlife. The devil represents chaos, the individual, and the void. By placing them face to face, the author created a spiritual crossroads. Every time a reader opened the book to that middle section, they were forced to choose which side to look at. Interestingly, the page with the devil is significantly darker than the rest of the book. For centuries, people believed this was because the devil's presence burned the parchment. Modern science, however, has a more human explanation. The page is darkened because it was the most looked-at page in history, exposed to light and human touch more than any other. Part III, the Emperor's Madness and the Prague Connection. Fast forward to the late 1500s. The Codex Gigas arrived in Prague at the court of Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf was not a typical king. He was a recluse who preferred the company of alchemists, astronomers like Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe, and occultists. Rudolf became obsessed with the Codex. He believed that the book held the secret to the philosopher's stone and the key to eternal life. He spent hours alone with the manuscript, tracing the lines of the devil's portrait. The Curse of the Emperor. History notes that the longer Rudolf possessed the book, the more detached from reality he became. He grew paranoid, eventually losing his throne to his brother and dying in isolation. The Devil's Bible had claimed its most powerful victim yet. Part IV, the science of the one scribe theory. In 2007. The National Library of Sweden allowed a team of forensic scientists to perform a handwriting autopsy on the Codex. This is where the story shifts from mythology to a terrifying biological reality. The findings, consistency, the analysis confirmed that the ductus, the way the pen hits the parchment, never changed. Whether it was the first page or the 300th, the pressure, the angle, and the style remained identical. The ink, most medieval books show variations in ink, because monks would mix a new batch every few days. The Codex Gigas uses a consistent type of ink made from crushed insect nests, iron gall, and the chemical signature is remarkably uniform throughout the 310 pages. The conclusion: it was indeed written by one man, but the psychological toll of such a task is unimaginable. To maintain that level of perfection for 20 to 30 years requires a level of focus that borders on a trance-like state. Historians now wonder, was Herman the Recluse in a state of religious mania, or was he truly driven by a force outside himself? Part V, the ghost of Podlis. The monastery where it all began, Podlis, no longer exists. It was destroyed during the Hussite Wars in the 15th century. Today, only a small-scale model and a plaque remain. However, locals in the Czech Republic still tell stories of a shadowy monk seen wandering the ruins on the anniversary of the book's completion. They say he isn't looking for the book, he's looking for the soul he traded to finish it. The legacy today, when the Codex Gigas was briefly loaned back to Prague in 2007, thousands of people lined up for blocks, waiting hours just to catch a 30-second glimpse of the devil's page. There is an undeniable magnetic pull to this object. It represents the ultimate human ambition, to know everything regardless of the cost. This concludes the deep historical narrative of the Codex Gigas. Part VI, the mystery of the 8 missing pages. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Codex Gigas isn't what is inside it, but what was ripped out. When the manuscript is examined today, it is clear that 8 leaves, 16 pages, are missing from the section directly following the portrait of the devil. These pages weren't lost to time or decay. They were systematically and cleanly excised. What did they contain? Speculation has haunted historians for centuries. Some believe they contain the monastic rule of St. Benedict, the strict code of conduct for monks. However, others point to the placement. Why would someone remove standard monastic rules right after the image of Satan? A darker theory suggests those pages contained a devil's prayer or a specific ritual to summon the Prince of Darkness himself. In the 17th century, rumor spread that the pages were removed because they were too dangerous for the human soul to contemplate. If the legend of Herman the Recluse is true, these pages might have been the fine print of his contract, the record of what he saw when the devil took the pen from his hand. Part VII, the 1648 siege, a trophy of blood. The story of the Codex is also a story of survival through one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The 30 Years' War. By 1648, the Swedish Empire was a rising superpower. As the war reached its bloody conclusion, Swedish troops led by General Hans Christoph von Königsmark stormed the Malá Strana district of Prague. Their goal wasn't just land, It was the intellectual wealth of the Holy Roman Empire. The Swedes broke into the royal palace and seized Emperor Rudolf II's Kunstkammer, cabinet of curiosities. Amidst the gold, the clocks, and the rare jewels, the soldiers found the Codex Gigas. It was so heavy that it required a specialized wagon to transport it through the mud and carnage of war-torn Europe. When it arrived in Stockholm, it was presented to Queen Christina of Sweden, one of the most learned women of her age. She was fascinated by it, but the curse seemed to follow. Within years of the book's arrival, Christina, the daughter of the great Protestant hero Gustavus Adolphus, shocked the world by abdicating her throne and converting to Catholicism. Once again, the book was present during the downfall of a monarch. Part VIII, the physical toll of creation. To understand the real story, we have to talk about the 160 donkeys. Modern conservationists have mapped the parchment of the Codex. Medieval vellum was made by soaking animal skins in lime, scraping away the hair, and stretching them on frames to dry. To create a book of this size, you couldn't just use any skin. It had to be consistent in thickness and color. Imagine the sheer scale of the slaughter required. 160 animals were killed just to provide the paper for this one volume. This reflects a level of wealth and resources that the tiny monastery of Podlis simply shouldn't have possessed. This leads to a historical conspiracy theory. Was the Codex Gigas funded by someone far more powerful than a group of humble monks? Some suggest a secret patron, perhaps a high-ranking noble or a dark cardinal, who wanted a comprehensive record of both the holy and the unholy. Part IX, the psychological prison. Let's return to the scribe, the man we call Herman the Recluse. If we remove the supernatural element, we are left with a story of human endurance that is almost more frightening. To write the Codex Gigas alone, Herman would have had to live in a state of total sensory deprivation. In the medieval world, a recluse was someone who was literally walled into a cell, usually attached to a church, with only a small slit for food. He would have lived in near darkness, surrounded by the smell of old parchment and the sound of his own breath. Psychologists who have studied the Codex suggest that the devil in the book might not have been a literal demon, but a hallucination born of isolation. After 20 years of darkness and solitude, the face of the devil might have been the only friend Herman had left. The portrait is remarkably vivid, the green face, the two tongues, the talons. It looks like a portrait painted from life. Part X, the modern guardian today. The Codex Gigas rests behind bulletproof glass in the National Library of Sweden, Kungliga biblioteket. It is kept at a constant temperature and humidity, monitored by sensors 24/7. But even with modern technology, the book remains alive, in a sense. In 2007, when it was transported back to Prague for a temporary exhibition, it was moved under military-grade security. It traveled in a custom-built, shock-absorbent crate, guarded by armed men, as if it were a nuclear warhead or a head of state. The Czech people welcomed it back not as a book, but as a long-lost national treasure, and perhaps a reminder of a dark debt that has never been fully settled. The final mystery: why Gigas? The name Codex Gigas simply means giant book, but in the medieval mind, giants were remnants of an older, more chaotic world. By creating a giant book, the scribe was trying to contain the entire world within 2 covers. When you look at the final page of the manuscript, the writing doesn't trail off. It doesn't look like the work of a man who was tired. It stops with a sense of absolute completion. Whether it was written by a monk in a single night of hellish intervention, or by a lonely man over 30 years of silent devotion, the Codex Gigas stands as the ultimate monument to the human obsession with the unknown. It is a bridge between the medieval and the modern, the sacred and the profane. And as you walk away from its glass case in Stockholm, you cannot help but look back, just to make sure the green-faced demon is still confined to the page. As the sun began its ascent over the Bohemian horizon on that fateful morning in 1230, the legend of the Codex Gigas reached its climax. But every story, no matter how ancient or dark, must find its end. To finish this tale, we must look at the final fate of the man who started it all, the legacy of the book in our digital age, and the ultimate question: what does the Devil's Bible truly tell us about ourselves? Part XI, The silence of the cell, what became of Herman the Recluse after the morning of the miracle. The monastery records are agonizingly silent. If the legend holds that he traded his soul, then the completion of the book was not an end, but a beginning of a different kind of imprisonment. Some say that when the abbots opened the door to his cell, they found the massive book resting on a wooden lectern, but Herman himself was transformed. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was a hollow shell, his eyes reflecting the same green void as the portrait he had just painted. He lived the rest of his days in a state of perpetual silence, never speaking another word, as if his voice had been the final ingredient in the devil's ink. Others believe the monastery, terrified by the unholy speed of the work, kept Herman hidden away. They had their miracle, but they knew it was tainted. They got their greatest book in the world, but at the cost of the monastery's sanctity. Within 2 centuries, the monastery of Podlis was wiped from the map, leaving only the Codex as a wandering orphan of history. Part XII, digital immortality. The demon in the machine in the 21st century, the Codex Gigas underwent its final transformation. In 2007, the National Library of Sweden began a massive project to digitize every single page. It is a strange irony. A book that was supposedly created through a pact with a prince of darkness is now stored as bits and bytes on servers across the globe. You can sit in a coffee shop in New York, London, or Tokyo and flip through the devil's page with a swipe of your finger. But even in high-definition 4K scans, the mystery remains. Scholars use multispectral imaging to look beneath the ink, hoping to find a hidden message or the ghost of a second scribe. They find nothing. The science continues to confirm the impossible. One man, one hand, one life, one book. Part XIII. The final lesson of the Codex. Why are we still obsessed with the Codex Gigas? Why does a 165-pound pile of donkey skins and medieval ink still capture the world's imagination? The answer lies in the human condition. The Codex Gigas is the ultimate symbol of our desire to have it all. It is a library of all knowledge, medicine, history, spirituality, and even the dark arts bound together. It represents our reach for the divine and our flirtation with the damned. To the historian, it is a miracle of medieval preservation. To the occultist, it is a gateway to ancient power. To the scientist, it is a testament to the incredible capacity of the human brain to endure isolation. But perhaps the most profound lesson is this. The book survived fires, wars, and the collapse of empires. It survived being thrown out of windows and being looted by conquerors. It is a reminder that knowledge is heavier than gold and far more durable. The closing, the shadow on the wall if you ever find yourself in the National Library of Sweden, standing before the original manuscript. You will notice something peculiar. The room is quiet, a heavy, respectful silence. As you look at the portrait of the devil, you might notice that he isn't depicted as a terrifying beast of fire. He is depicted as a prisoner. He is squatting in a small, square space, almost like a cell. In the end, the legend of Herman the Recluse is a mirror. Herman was walled in by stone. The devil was walled in by parchment. We are all, in some way, trying to write our own story before the sun rises, and our time is up. The Codex Gigas remains open, its ink as dark as the night it was supposedly written. It waits for the next set of eyes to gaze upon its pages, continuing a dialogue between the light of the library and the shadows of the past that will never truly end.